My name is Ron Richards. I live at 124 Township Line Road. That is in an R5 designated area. So I do have some concerns about this issue. I'd like to say one thing that I'm sure Craig Miller will agree with. I'm glad to see the county being very careful to make sure that whatever ordinance they use to consider this issue was in effect at the time the building permit was vested. That having been said, I also read in the newspaper, if it can be considered reliable, that Craig Miller called this a mansion. Now, whether that is true or not, I think the county should make the determination after hearing from anybody that is concerned. And just because an applicant calls something, it should not be considered as the final say. Especially when you have a mansion that is said to be a bed and breakfast, that could very easily be interpreted to be a hotel or a motel. And if it is, then it should probably be considered under your existing zoning ordinance. Some other suggestions is, if this type of development was really within the definition of what was allowed under your zoning ordinance, then this environmental impact statement that accompanied the zoning ordinance probably should have considered the impacts of this type of development. And not just the one house or the one hotel, whichever you decide, but it should have considered that this might have been done numerous times with the cumulative impacts of something like this. And if it did not consider that type of a development, then that would tend to be, that would tend to dictate that this was really not what was intended by the meaning of a bed and breakfast or a residence. And it would be more likely that it would be a hotel or a motel. Now, the big thing I have a concern about is this. A change in an ordinance now to prohibit something that had been applied for could be argued as evidence that the previous ordinance did not prohibit what had been applied for. So it would not surprise me if an attorney for the applicant went and made an argument such as, Your Honor, they changed this ordinance and they needed to. That suggested that they needed to in order to handle the situation, if that's what you're thinking. But that argument would very likely be made. In that respect, paragraph 11 is particularly concerning to me. It says that this change is necessary to prevent vested buildings, not the vesting of buildings, not vesting of building permits or anything like that. But it seems to me like that statement is putting the cart before the horse, because it seems to me that this question of what is a hotel or a motel is still being considered. In fact, I understand you submitted this question to some expert outside the county. So before you adopt an ordinance that has the language in it that paragraph 11 has, you ought to make some sort of determination of whether or not that is really true. Now, I could suggest that if you think that maybe this issue should be considered in an ordinance, you list a bunch of provisions in your existing ordinance that could be interpreted to relate to this definition. But then you come and say, well, we need this. So that would imply that those provisions don't say what they seem to say. So anyway, those are pretty much things that I think need to be considered, and I think you really need to have the advice of your prosecutor on these specific questions before you go any further, before you adopt either one of these ordinances. So thank you.
Thank you, Ed Bowen.
Good morning, Commissioners. Ed Bowen, P.O. Box 111, Cloud Bay, and I stand before you in opposition to this interim control because it's being applied across the county at large, and I do agree this is being driven by a targeted issue, and I have real concerns when it comes to the western end of the county. In specific, this was brought before the Planning Commission, as was brought up by the staff, that discussion has already occurred. Well, listening to that Planning Commission discussion on the 17th of August, there was very little discussion. It was mostly an informative staff briefing with a few targeted questions about the Swim Bay project, but there was no county at large discussion on this particular project or on this particular issue before the Planning Commission. So I believe we're putting the cart before the horse. It affects dramatically the entire county. Things such as what is rural characteristics? You know, in the ordinance you have before you, it says in section 5 there, but are not limited to. So what's the scope of what are we limiting rural characterization to when the Planning Commission hasn't even addressed that particular topic? And the requirements of rural element in section 6. What I want to bring up is, you know, there's something called the rain shadow here of the eastern end of the county, but on the western end of the county, yesterday we received 2 inches of rain. Well, you know, buildings sometimes take care of that problem of the rainfall, and the size of the building is proportional to the amount of rainfall. And we deal with those issues through stormwater management and stuff like that. So we're not dealing with the requirements of rural element in the western part of the county. Getting further into the details, you know, 10,000 square feet. So if I build a barn and I put 2 lots in there because I want to store hay, that's going to be calculated into my square footage. So I automatically have a problem on the west end of the county. I might have a small footprint of the building, but I'm going to put multiple layers so I can store hay, but I'm going to be limited because I have a 10,000 square foot multiple floor limitation and not a footprint issue. Right out of the gate, I have a problem with this interim control coming in here. So here's my solution to you today. First off, I oppose this. I don't think it's called for to allow the Department of Community Development and the Planning Commission to address this. The time, you don't need an interim control to do that. They've got their job to do. They can do it. I don't see people standing in line to build 10,000 square foot or more buildings other than the one project on the table that's before most of the folks here. So what my solution is 2 parts. One is down there in section 1 of your ordained section. You list quite a few zoned areas. Rural very low, R20. Think about this on the scalability. A 10,000 square foot building on a 20 acre plus piece of property on the west end of the county is not going to fit the drive behind why you're doing this in the first place. And there's quite a few. But if you have to, such things such as rural moderate R2 and rural R1, even maybe rural low mix, some of these that are really small scale rural, maybe there is a scale issue there. So there's a possible solution that might compromise on this. And I'm not quite clear in the legalities, but maybe some provision in the ordinance that allows a conditional use or variance for special needs or whatever. You know, if a landowner comes to you and says, well, your ordinance says I can't build this, but here's my situation. And I need some, I'm looking for language in the ordinance to address something like that. To give the user, the end user of this, the direction of how to deal with my problem as a landowner, but also to give some latitude instead of just saying, what I read in this ordinance is a carte blanche, 10,000 square feet, that's it, nothing else. So those are my 2 solutions today, and again, I oppose the interim ordinance. Thank you.
Kelly Fox.